You talk about global security architecture in your book, and I was wondering, do you think that ending absolute poverty or extreme poverty will decrease threats to global security?
Of course, poverty is always a cause of and opportunity for instability. And societies have a very hard time remaining stable and peaceful when parts of those societies are struggling for daily survival. So there's no question that if poverty is ended, the sense of desperation and the demagoguery that often takes advantage of desperation would also decline. We see in some of the poorest places in the world insurgencies, we see civil conflict, we see strife, we see terrorism, and so forth. And so there's no doubt that ending poverty is not only a good in and of itself for the relief of suffering, but it's also a political good, that it leads to greater security and greater stability, not only for the places directly afflicted by poverty, but their neighborhood and the world.
Yeah, I was just thinking about this in terms of we Americans spend an enormous amount of money on global security architecture. And maybe some of that funding would be better off spent on development because it might reduce the possibility of conflict rather than addressing the conflicts with military solutions.
If only U.S. leaders would hear your wise voice, because we spend so much more on military approaches in very poor places. And Afghanistan is an example of that. The U.S. occupied Afghanistan for 20 years. It solved no problem. And the reason is that it devoted the vast preponderance of a very, very hefty budget to military approaches. And when it came to development, it didn't know what it was doing. It had no coherent approach. It solved no problems for Afghanistan, and it finally left Afghanistan 20 years later in a complete mess because the U.S. occupation had solved nothing. And it was filled, unfortunately, with a lot of ignorance in the U.S. Government about what to do. So even when they tried to support development, it was amateur hour from beginning to end.
Well, I wanted to talk also pivot to something a little more positive. In the book, you mentioned in 2005 that 1/6 of the world was living in extreme poverty. We're now in 2024, and that number is considerably smaller as a proportion of the total human population. And I was wondering if you could outline what has changed in raising so many people out of extreme poverty in the last 19 years.
Well, I'll give you two words: China, India. Because China went from basically pervasive poverty in 1980, by some measures 60 or 70 or even 80%, depending on whose poverty line you use, to essentially no poverty by 2020. So this was for China's vast population of 1.4 billion people. This was transformative for China, but in the global statistics, it meant that the global rate of poverty went down tremendously. We're under 10% of the world, well under 10% of the world living in extreme poverty right now, and China has no part of that. India is second in this because India also had vast poverty. India's behind chronologically China's development by 10 or 15 years, perhaps, maybe 15 years or so. But now India is growing rapidly. It's using the digital revolution to reach poor villages in rural areas that now are connected and now are finding new markets and new livelihoods and a spread of healthcare and education using the new digital technology. So this is a big advance. My view is that Africa is the next to come. Africa now has the highest concentration of extreme poverty in the world. Most of the low-income countries are in Africa. But Africa can achieve what China achieved and what India is achieving right now. It's starting a bit later for all sorts of historical and political and geographical reasons, but it can achieve the same.
Yeah, I want to ask you a lot more about Africa. There's a forum coming up very soon, FOCAC, the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, and African leaders will be coming here to Beijing. I'm assuming a lot of that is going to be looking for financing, but I wanted to know what you think African leaders are going to be looking for from China, and what you think at this time China will be offering to African leaders in terms of development and cooperation.
First, I think China offers a kind of roadmap for Africa. As I said, for 40 years between 1980 and 2020, China ended pervasive poverty. I believe that this is the best roadmap for Africa for the next 40 years. And Africa dates its timing to 2063, which is the 100th anniversary of African unity, the establishment of the Organization of African Unity, now the African Union. So that's essentially 40 years ahead from now, between now and 2063. And I'd like to see an Africa by 2063 that's completely ended poverty. It's over it. It's a high income region. Now, what's interesting for me about Africa and China is it's the same population. Both have 1.4 billion people. There's a huge difference, though. The colonial legacy left Africa with 55 separate countries. China is 1, Africa is 55. There are actually 53 African countries in China's Belt and Road Initiative. So the key for Africa as a starting point is to see itself as a unity, not as 55 separate cases, but as truly a union with an integrated continental scale market, with infrastructure that crosses national boundaries, with an Africa-wide power pool, digital interconnectivity, rail connectivity, and so forth. And if Africa can really accomplish that kind of organizational, administrative, economic unity, then it'll be a lot more like China in its capacity to achieve rapid economic development.
Mm. In the past, China, along with other partners from around the world, have helped develop hydropower, but also fossil fuel burning technologies also as part of electrifying the continent. But recently, we've seen massive gains in China's green and renewable sectors, and China actually is just leading green development right now. It's so much to the point that Yellen has said that it's overcapacity. And you work in sustainable development. Do you think this new technology could be a step towards sustainable development architecture for the developing world?
Of course, what we need is the green BRI. And there is such a concept, of course. There's the Belt and Road Initiative, but there is an organization for the Belt and Road Initiative Green Council. I'm working with it. The idea is that the Belt and Road Initiative, which is an extremely important initiative for China and for the rest of the world, and it is to build 21st century state-of-the-art infrastructure to connect China with the other parts of the world and to help those other parts of the world achieve rapid economic development. That should be based on green and digital technology. But that's not only good from the environmental point of view and the developmental point of view, it's good for China because China has vast capacity in every single green and digital technology. And this, I think, is a pivotal point. Yes, Secretary of Treasury of the US, Janet Yellen, said China has overcapacity. That's not right. China has vast capacity, I would say, and it should be deployed. It should be enabling Africa to have 7 to 10% per year economic growth by building out massive solar power, which is China's specialty, building out fast rail, which is China's specialty, building out 5G, which is China's specialty. So you put BRI, you put Shenzhen, home of Huawei, to work in Africa, you're going to see incredibly rapid development. I happened earlier this year to be in rural Ethiopia, and I got a real taste of it because China helped Ethiopia to finance massive hydropower. And then it also helped Ethiopia to build a fast rail for freight, in this case, from Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia, to Djibouti, the port on the Red Sea. So I was visiting impoverished rural farmers in Ethiopia, actually not so impoverished anymore. They were basically telling me how they're making money now. They're growing avocados, which was unthinkable before because they have a market. What is their market? Their market is the countries of the Arabian Peninsula, the Saudis, the Emirates, because they can get fresh avocados to Dubai for the restaurants of Dubai, because now they have electricity for greenhouses, for transport, for processing, for cooling, for refrigeration, and they have a fast rail which gets to the port, which gets this produce, which is perishable, to the markets of the region. And those are rich markets nearby across the Red Sea. So that's an example of development before your eyes. And I saw it, and the farmers were very happy, by the way.
That's an amazing story. Thank you for sharing that. I wanted to know a little bit more about the SEZs, or special economic zones, because China has been helping different African nations and other nations build these sort of zones, and most of them, I just looked at a map recently, are particularly close to coastlines. So you're an economist, that's your specialty. Are these kinds of factory jobs going to lead to increased prosperity there, in your opinion?
Yeah. Yes, and in fact, on that same trip to Ethiopia, not only did I visit the rural areas, but we passed through some of these special economic zones. Basically, these are large areas that are devoted to clusters of enterprises where you have not only these clusters providing inputs and outputs for each other, but also you have good, sophisticated transport facilities, power, water supply for industrial processing. You have digital technology. So you bring everything together. This is what China did all over China. When I would visit Western China, for example, 20 years ago, when the place was rural and poor, but it wanted to industrialize, it would set aside an industrial zone. I'd be taken there, I'd be shown a model of what it was going to look like in 20 years, and lo and behold, the model was accurate. But the idea was to provide the physical infrastructure of all these kinds that I mentioned, of transport, of power, of communications, of digital access, of water, sewerage, sanitation, and so forth, all in one place so that you could have efficient manufacturing processes. In the place that I visited, there was various kinds of machine building. There was pharmaceuticals. There were some IT companies that were coming in. And so this was in Oromia, one of the provinces of Ethiopia. And this is a well-tested approach. Now, Africa and any country develops not on one sector alone. So it's not only manufacturing. Africa has vast agricultural potential that needs sophisticated capital investments for precision agriculture, for multi-cropping, for irrigation, for water management, and so forth. Africa, of course, has vast mineral resources, and these need to be developed. Some of them are the key strategic minerals for the green and digital revolution, the cobalt of Central Africa and in DRC and elsewhere. Of course, vast copper deposits and so forth. The manufacturing sector, but there will be an IT sector, there will be a culture sector, tourism, pharmaceuticals, finance. All of this needs to be built out in a rapidly developing region. All of it depends on infrastructure and on skills. And these are two areas, and I would say a roadmap, as I started with to say we can be like China in the sense that China grew rapidly for 40 years. Africa can grow rapidly for 40 years if we think like Africa rather than 55 separate countries. And if we have a good strategy, a good roadmap, and invest like crazy in skills. And this is another area where China can really play a role. China has great universities. China has great online learning and teaching. China has great companies like Huawei or BYD or others that can do a tremendous amount of training as well, and can do a lot of it online, give certificates and so forth to help create a technical cadre in Africa.
I think you already answered the question, but I want to ask again because you have personal experience in China, quite a bit of it. You participated in a lot of, as an advisor to various bodies in China, economic bodies, as well as the government itself, during the poverty alleviation programs. Before I move on, actually, we're going to get criticism. I'm going to get criticism for the use of the word poverty. When we say the elimination of poverty, we mean extreme poverty. We mean people who are not starving. Of course, there is still poverty, in China, but there's no starvation, extreme poverty. But during these alleviation programs, they were able to bring an end to extreme or absolute poverty. What programs did you see in China that you think would work elsewhere, or might work elsewhere, or might be worth trying elsewhere?
When you think about ending poverty, you start with broad-based economic development. So China ended poverty most importantly by moving from low income levels to high income levels. That means, in general, more productivity, higher technologies, higher skills, more education levels, better infrastructure. So that's a general process, not targeted at the poor per se. The second thing you do, in addition to the broad development, is the targeting. The targeting can be geographical, because when China opened up the economy around 1980 in its reform process, it was the coastal areas that jumped ahead. And I was asked around the year 2000 to have a look at the western provinces because they were lagging behind. The big investments came to all the coastal regions, whether it was Tianjin, Beijing, Shanghai, or down the coast to Guangdong and so forth. These were the coastal developments, but the interior needed a focus. And so the Western China Development Program was introduced by China around 2000 as a geographical program. But then there's also the targeting at the individual level, the kind of social support for very poor children, the intention that everybody, down to the poorest of people, needs health care, needs adequate nutrition, may need specific social support or social protection, may need some guidance by a social worker. And so there are all these different layers. That by far the most important, actually, is the broad-based development, because that does lift a great part of the population. But then you need to target. You need to target those geographical regions that are not being lifted by the broad development automatically. And you need to target, even within affluent cities, people whose, for whatever their fate, disabilities, bad luck, individual circumstances are suffering. And that was the kind of triple approach that China used and that will apply in the African context.
In your book, you mentioned disease like malaria, and you mentioned that when people are trapped in poverty, because there is a lack of human resources, they tend to stay there. And in China's case, in Africa's case, let's start there, there's malaria, whereas that is not a major issue in China. So I'm wondering, over the last 10 or 20 years, has the United Nations made good headway in terms of eradicating some of these diseases?
Well, it's interesting, you think poverty leaves you vulnerable to disease, but disease makes you poor. And the causation, therefore, goes in both directions. And in the African context, I've argued, it's not completely without some controversy, but I've argued that because Africa's disease background, with many tropical diseases that are quite specific to Africa or intense in Africa for many geographical reasons, is actually one of the explanations of Africa's historic poverty. And malaria is probably the poster child of that, because malaria is a disease that thrives in hot tropical environments. And Africa also has a particular kind of mosquito, if you go into the details, that transmits malaria in a very efficient way. So my argument has been that one of the things that we need to do is to target the end of these tropical diseases. And I helped establish, now it's 24 years ago, something called the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, and Malaria. And it was set up to make this kind of focal investment in disease control. Now, when it came to malaria, it was a Chinese traditional herb, actually, Qinghua So, which is wormwood in English, where a Nobel winner eventually in China in Nobel Science Medicine won the Nobel Prize for taking a traditional Chinese herb, finding the active ingredient, which goes by the scientific name of artemisinin, and making the state-of-the-art malaria control medicine. That has played a real role in malaria control in Africa. And so this is a good China-Africa linkage, very, very direct, very powerful. But to get a cure like this, even though it's very inexpensive, but to get a cure like this actually to reach a child infected with malaria in time requires organization. It requires staffing. It requires training. And that is why you need not only the cure, you need actually the structure of a public health system. And some of that's in place. Malaria deaths are down, but it's a pretty pernicious disease, and even remedies that we thought that were in hand, various insecticides and so forth, the disease agent mutates around those, or the mosquitoes mutate around those, so you're constantly in a battle, and this battle continues.
Mm. The last time we spoke a couple of years ago, you mentioned that we should be investing $1 trillion a year to address global development, in addition to what we're already spending. I spoke recently with a Professor Astrid Haas, an urban economist from Uganda. She said that there may actually be enough finance, but there's a bottleneck of planners who may not be able to create plans and apply for loans and grants efficiently enough to get all of that financing deployed to where it needs to be. So I wanted to know, do you think among all of the private investors, the IMF, World Bank, the AIIB, the African Bank, and so forth, MOFCOM, do you think there exists enough financing now? And if not, what needs to be done to increase funding?
Basically, yes, there does exist enough financing, but there are two kinds of bottlenecks. One is the one you just mentioned. You need good projects that are at the core of long-term development. And I stress that's infrastructure and investing in people, especially in education and in their basic health. And so that's where the funding should be directed as a high priority. If you do that, by the way, businesses will come because they'll make a lot of money. If there's good infrastructure and if there are skilled workers and there are healthy workers, you'll get private business coming in. But the other bottleneck is that poor countries, even when they have plans and they have investments, find when they go to the capital market that they're told, no, you're not creditworthy. You have a credit rating of double B minus, and that means the interest rate you have to pay is going to be 5 percentage points per year higher than a country in Europe or the United States. So a European country might borrow at 3%, but this poor country might be told, no, you're going to have to pay 8% or 10% interest. Suddenly you can't make the project. When you translate that, the electricity is too expensive, or the road tolls are too expensive, and so forth. So the cost of capital is a terrible problem. And the general issue that we face right now is that poor countries are rated very poorly. They're deemed to be poor credit risks. And my argument is, no, that's actually not right. Poor countries can grow a lot faster than rich countries. Poor countries can do what China has done. But the IMF and the World Bank have had a strange view. They've said, no, don't borrow. Even if you can get it, you're dangerous, you're risky, you're going to go into default. And this is a part of the intellectual debate that's underway right now. I say more debt that is directed towards infrastructure and towards education, towards healthcare. Go for it. Build out rapid development. Learn from China's experience. Of course, not only by borrowing, also by raising one's own saving rates, also by attracting foreign investment, but do borrow more to complete the electricity system. Do borrow more to build the road network. Do borrow more to make sure that internet connectivity is there. And for the IMF and the World Bank and other countries, and for Chinese policymakers and so forth, I say, understand that these poor countries today could be rich, but it's going to take 30 or 40 years. So make those loans long term. Don't expect in 5 years you're going to get repaid. No, you won't. These have to be long-term loans. The countries have to invest them properly, that's for sure. But what China accomplished, in principle, can be accomplished in Africa or in other places. And the fact that India is growing rapidly now as well is another illustration. Countries are not inherently irreversibly trapped in poverty if you have a good strategy, a good plan, good bankable projects, and access to the capital investment financing that you need. You can do it.
China has this phrase, build a road if you want to be rich. And I keep hearing this over and over and over again from not just Chinese people, but people around the world. And when we're talking about a continent the size of Africa, and it's enormous, I've seen it in different ways presented to me.
Yes, you can put in North America, Europe, and so many continents inside Africa because it is so vast in land area.
And you mentioned 55 countries, so China is one country. So it's much easier for them to build a national high-speed rail infrastructure. If we're trying to build logistics especially that get the inland countries that don't have access to ports, rail access to ports like you mentioned in Ethiopia, it really looks like there are a lot of roadblocks. Could you outline what are these roadblocks and how do we overcome those so that we can get continent-wide logistics infrastructure to increase economic access and interdependence?
Well, you said it, roadblocks. There are literally roadblocks, by the way.
Literally.
There are roadblocks at borders. There should not be. Europe removed its internal borders so that there is one European market. You can travel, as I often do, between European countries without showing your passports. You're in the Schengen region, so-called, so it's free mobility internally. Africa has established an Africa-wide open market, but it has to implement that. Not only in policy terms, that there's free mobility, that there's one airspace for Africa, and so on, but that there is also the physical interconnectivity. And roads these days mean many things. They mean, of course, physical roads for overland transport. They mean rail, and fast rail is extremely important. They mean the connection of the port facilities. They mean a unified airspace for Africa. So it's both the hardware and the software of infrastructure and digital, of course. Africa has increased its access to the global internet backbone significantly, but there still is fiber to be laid to make sure that all parts of Africa have access. And I want 5G in there, and I want Huawei in there to be providing a lot of that 5G.
I really want to learn more about US aid. It's a very messy area to get into, and it's so controversial sometimes. Getting information about it is complicated, but I know you have a lot more experience. So I wanted to ask you, about the US tools for addressing development around the world. What are your thoughts about US aid and other US based infrastructure for developing countries outside of the United States, developing foreign nations?
Well, the first thing to say is the U.S. is rich, but viewed relative to its wealth, it's rather stingy. The amount of development assistance is very, very small. It was viewed as a Cold War tool. So we should give aid so that the Soviets don't make headway. When the Cold War seemed to end back in 1991 with the end of the Soviet Union, the U.S. cut its aid programs substantially. USAID became not a broad-based development agency, but it became targeted at places where the U.S. had military activities underway, like Afghanistan. It didn't do a great job in that, unfortunately. And in general, there were lots of attacks. We don't like foreign aid. So there was nothing like the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a broad initiative of partnership and so on. Well, China has gotten the attention of the U.S. because the U.S. watches what China is doing and views these issues in competitive terms with China. So the U.S. is starting to think about development in Africa again after a long hiatus where there was very little attention. But my advice to the U.S. policymakers is stop thinking so much in competitive terms. This isn't be concerned for Africa because China is. Why don't Chinese, African, and American organizations work together, actually in partnership, to help spur the infrastructure development in Africa? It seems almost unthinkable, but there's some very big projects. Probably the most famous is called Inga Falls, which is a magnificent potential hydropower resource for Central Africa, for the center of Africa, in the Democratic Republic of Congo and the Republic of Congo. And it could develop perhaps 70 billion watts of high quality hydropower, but it requires major investment that could only come politically. So why not the US and China and Europe and India working together rather than viewing Africa as a turf for geopolitical competition, which is always a terrible way to view things. So this is what I would recommend. But unfortunately, the U.S. really lost interest in this for a long time. Thankfully, China did not lose interest because China sees the Belt and Road Initiative not as charity, but as win-win. Win for China, win for the rest of the world. And I view that as absolutely correct. And I'd like the United States, instead of often bad-mouthing Belt and Road Initiative out of jealousy, rather saying, we'll partner. Let's partner together on some of these big projects that could really make a difference for development in Africa.
I mean, you're saying what I'm hoping, but it doesn't seem like our policymakers are getting in line with that thinking. I wanted to understand the IMF and the World Bank more, because you have a lot of experience, and there are a lot of different books. It's also an area of great controversy. I've read about this idea of the Washington Consensus, a one size fits all approach that was used in the 80s and 90s to sort of force economic growth, which doesn't seem to bear dividends. So I wanted to ask you, is this something that the IMF and World Bank are moving beyond, or is this something that they're still characterizes their participation for loan recipient countries? Are they still making demands on the internal economic structure of recipient countries? And is this good? Is this bad? Or has the criticism mischaracterized their participation with developing countries?
Both institutions are led right now by really committed people. Kristalina Georgieva at the IMF, AJ Banga at the World Bank. They're both absolutely very talented, smart, committed people who want to promote global economic development. So that's a very good start and very important. Both institutions need, I would say, an upgrade. They need to be more effective. They need to be larger. They need to be empowered. For example, the World Bank is just too small. It's got a big name, World Bank, but the amount of financing that it provides is really quite modest because its capital base is actually quite modest. So one of the main proposals on the table for many years now is increase the capital of the World Bank. Unfortunately, the United States has been blocking that. And the reason it's been blocking that is twofold. One, just kind of being miserly. And second, if the capital increase were to take place, no doubt China would get a bigger vote in the World Bank. And the U.S. says, oh, no, we can't let that happen. So even geopolitics, again, comes into it there. So we need a larger World Bank. I think it would be a more effective World Bank. It could provide financing for some of these critical areas. I would like to see China, the United States, European Union, get on with it. They've been talking about this for a long time. Stop viewing this geopolitically. View it as a development priority. There is a G20 meeting coming up in Brazil this fall. Agree to increase the capital of the World Bank, please, because this is straightforward. Every expert commission, every report, every study says more capital for a more effective institution. Then I think the ideas that drive these institutions can also be improved. As I said, they're very cautious when it comes to poor countries in the sense of telling these countries, be careful, don't borrow and so forth. I don't want them to be cautious that way. I want them to be bold and say, we have to end poverty. And China shows that it can be done. And let's get on with a rapid growth framework for Africa. And that means being very bold in the scale of investments. That's what I would like to see from these institutions.
Well, it seems to me that I think it's 15% that the United States tries to keep in terms of maintaining its veto powers within these institutions, that if China wanted to add several billion or tens of billion, the US could just match that to keep its 15%. I mean, I don't see why, the United States needs to fear China taking over these institutions because the United States could just add more money.
Thank you very much. This could all be done if our political class would understand that development is a good win-win proposition for everybody. Nobody has to lose out of this. And considering what we waste on wars, if we just put a fraction of that into development, we absolutely make all these breakthroughs.
Thank you for saying that. You are my hero, sir. I want to move on to Sino-U.S. relations. You already touched on this, but I wanted to ask, in the context of the United States, like you said, seeing Chinese investment in Africa and elsewhere as a threat, the United States and some senators specifically are starting to say, "Well, we shouldn't be investing too," and that I'm excited by that. whether it's competition or it's cooperation, at least there would be more investment. So, do you think, that Africa could benefit from a little bit of competition between the US, the EU, and China trying to outdo each other in terms of development projects?
A little bit. I have no problem with a little bit of competition. Actually, I have a lot of concern with the level of vitriol that sometimes comes out of Washington towards China more generally. So I want the whole relationship to be put on better terms. I say every day in the United States, China is not a threat to the United States. China is not a threat to the world. The U.S. is not about to be taken over by China. All of these fears are groundless. And all of this rhetoric of the U.S. and China entering into conflict, or the U.S. needing to contain China, which is a crazy idea to begin with. How could it even think in those terms? This needs to be put aside. Now, countries can compete with each other. Even best neighbors can compete with each other. So that's fine. But the backdrop should not be high geopolitical tension. The backdrop should be normal cooperation of two successful parts of the world, U.S. and China.
I've noticed that some Chinese companies are setting up factories in the United States. There's one in Columbus, Ohio, with 600 or 1,000 workers. There's one being set up in Texas, and U.S. is blocking a lot of this kind of technology, the sustainable development kind of technology for the United States. And so I kind of wonder, is China offshoring factories to the United States, which is interesting to me, just fascinating. Is that going to create better relations between our countries because there are good factory jobs for Americans making solar and related technologies in the United States for the US market? What do you think about Chinese factories setting up shop in the US?
There are two dimensions to what is really a U.S. trade war on China, because the U.S. imposed unilateral tariffs, first under Trump. They were maintained under Biden. Now both presidential candidates are talking about either continuing or increasing the tariffs on China. So there's a trade war launched by the United States against China. It has two purposes. One is protection of the U.S. market, because the U.S., frankly, is just behind. It's behind in solar modules, like you said, in producing wind turbines, in producing hydrogen hydrolyzers to produce green hydrogen. In many, many areas, China is just the low-cost producer. Electric vehicles, battery supply chains, 5G, you name it. So part of the protection is old-fashioned protection because American companies are not competitive. American industry is not competitive right now. There's a lot to say about that. There's a second dimension of this protectionism, and that is to harm China. To say, well, China was growing on the basis of its exports to the U.S., we're going to put a stop to that. And U.S. policy has stopped that. China's exports have stopped growing to the U.S. They have started to decline from their peak levels. That's rather alarming, because it means that for China, a source of growth, which was just competitive business, was taken away. That's deliberate by the U.S. also. So there are two different motivations for U.S. policy. To the extent that this is about protection, maybe temporary protection as the U.S. catches up, the idea that China would come in and produce in the United States is akin to what happened with Japanese producers in the 1980s and 1990s, which again were ahead of the United States in low-cost technology, for example, Toyota, and the U.S. put on barriers to imports from Japan. Japanese companies moved in. Everybody was happy for the reason you said. More jobs created in the United States, improved technology. That was more or less a success story in its way. And this could happen also with Chinese investments in the United States. to the extent that it's this second geopolitical factor, we need a geopolitical solution. China's investments in the U.S. aren't going to solve the angst, the anxiety that U.S. strategists feel about the mere fact that China is big, powerful, and successful. And my advice to the U.S. is get over it. You know, that other countries can be big, successful, and productive, and it's not a threat to the United States that other countries have success. So I'm trying on a psychological level, I would say, stop being so afraid and stop the geopolitical games. They're dangerous, they're harmful, they are lose-lose propositions. And nothing's wrong from the U.S. point of view with China's success. This isn't a zero-sum game.
Pardon me. How can I think this is a question I ask everyone. Theoretically, this is a kind of an open-ended question. A lot of people's answer is related to people-to-people exchanges. You know, how can concerned people like you and me, or just anyone who would like to see a thaw between, in current relations between China and the U.S., help facilitate better understanding between our two nations?
First, we have to tell our own politicians, calm down, because the United States has been in perpetual war for decades. I don't know about you, I'm really tired of it. It's been war in Iraq. It was war in Afghanistan. It was war in Syria. It was war in Libya. It was war in Yemen. It was war in Ukraine. Stop! Enough! Make our streets cleaner, make our elevators work again, make our infrastructure work. Stop the wars. So this is my first point. And I think as citizens, more and more Americans are saying that, but I'd like to hear that even much more loudly, because there's a lot of saber rattling about China. China is not an enemy of the United States. It's not a threat to the United States. It doesn't aim to be a threat to the United States. So stop it. Enough. This is one thing that needs to be done. Second, of course, I'm as a professor, I see with my own eyes, I know with my own life experience, the value of having Chinese students, the value of having Chinese colleagues in other universities, university-to-university programs. You know, one of the tragic things that's happened because of, COVID was part of it, but also geopolitics, the number of Americans studying in China has plummeted at a higher university. So I'd say to students, go study. China is wonderful. 2,000 years of civilizational unity, 3,500 years of civilizational breakthroughs in culture, and absolutely marvelous. So go learn, go study, understand a different part of the world, and it will be good for you and your career and your lifetime experience. And President Xi Jinping has called for 50,000 Americans to be studying in China. This is a very, very good, smart idea. And I would say to American students and to American universities, respond to the call. Make joint programs with your counterparts in China. Find a partner in China. Have exchange programs, faculty exchange, student exchange, joint degree programs, online programs. Get your classes together, and so on, because there's a lot that can be done. You know, I have Zooms with China all the time. It's costless. I can make connections. I can do projects together. It can be done at extremely low cost. It can be done in high schools, in junior high schools. You don't have to wait for the government to do any of this. You need to find a counterpart. If you're a high school, find a high school counterpart in China. Go to the Chinese consulate. Say, we'd like to have a program with a high school in China. We'll do some online activities together. It's free. Just get online.
Yeah, those are some really, really good ideas. I hope that some teachers at the K through 12 level actually do that. That'd be fun to get two classes together, Zooming and like just making faces at each other. Anything.
Absolutely.
I guess my last question for you, and this comes from your book, you were talking about revitalization of the United Nations. And I wanted to know, because, obviously there have been ideas about how to make the United Nations more inclusive by changing the Security Council and the permanent votes, all kinds of things like that. How do you envision having a UN that works better than it does now?
Well, there's going to be a meeting in September called the Summit of the Future on September 22, 23. It's a very important meeting that the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, called, and all 193 member states are to show up to talk about that very question. And they will be looking at all sorts of areas of how to upgrade the UN for the remaining 75 years of the 21st century. They'll be talking about restructuring the Security Council, changing the veto so that one country can't stop the business of all the rest of the world. Maybe adding some chambers to the UN, like a UN Parliament, which is an idea that's on the table right now. How the UN could help to govern and make sure that the use is appropriate for artificial intelligence, how to reform the global financial system, as we were talking about, so that low-income countries can get access to quality financing, how to improve teaching worldwide so that young people learn about sustainable development and learn about each other's cultures. So the topics of what can be done in the classroom. So this Summit of the Future is exactly devoted to your question. There's a lot on the table. 5 buckets of areas were set aside: sustainable development, peacekeeping, governing technology, improved education, and new structures of the UN. And that will be the agenda. And I think it will kind of set a roadmap to upgrade and improve the UN institutions in the years ahead.